Welcome. Today we are going to talk about two amendments that are kind of a source of amusement sometimes when we look back on history, but in those days it wasn't amusing at all. So we're going to talk about Amendments 18 and 21. These are the Prohibition Amendment and Not Prohibition Amendments. All right. I will read section 1 of 18 for you. It says, after 1 year from the ratification of this article, the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors within, the importation thereof into, or the exportation thereof from the United States and all territory subject to the jurisdiction thereof for beverage purposes is hereby prohibited. And this was passed by Congress in 1917 and ratified in 1919. So it was an actual amendment that was so popular that it was made part of the Constitution, like that, like the states ratified this so that it could be an amendment. So let's talk a little bit about the backstory, okay? So, sometimes from our present, when we're looking at things, we look back and go, these people are all nuts. And sometimes the historians who aren't giving the whole picture will sometimes make the temperance, the prohibition, people look kind of nutty. So the facts are a little more detailed than that. So let's put context on this. So the temperance movement that this amendment came out of started around the 1870s and built up, kept growing and growing, especially in the 1890s and early 1900s. And it became very, very powerful movement. The part of the temperance movement that we hear the most about are organizations like the women's Christian temperance movement. It came out of a Christian, church movement. But it wasn't only that. But let's talk about the women's Christian temperance movement. So in those days, in the American culture, we had several things happening. So one was the Gilded Age, and it's fun to read about the Gilded Age. So in those days, thanks to the rise of factories and big business that was largely unregulated, and there was no income tax, so big corporations were really not having to pay for their growth and the earnings to the federal government to help run the government. So it was just like the time of great joy and expansion. And there were millionaires and there were American socialites marrying European royalty. And there's just all kinds of wonderful things happening in the Gilded Age for the people who were in the corporate world and the families that had grown into the blue bloods and the have-gots. So things were very good. That was a very small part of the population. Those factories were run by were worked in, the ones that are operating the factories, making the goods. Those people were often men working hours like that were unregulated, so the factories could require them to work 80 hours a week. Young women who were not married or were married and the family starving, so they had to take a job, and children. So there were no rules on child labor in those days. So a lot of the immigrants that were coming into the country had no way to get settled, no way to get connected, and so they were also, funneled right into these big mills and factories, and where there was no hope. All right, so what happens then through the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s is, people are working, 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 and especially the men with their extremely long hours. Um, they were exhausted by the end of the week, and there were people who were professional lurers, like drug dealers today. They would lure these men to the local bars, and there were bars everywhere. And it is reported that in those days, there was a higher percentage of alcoholism, like people drinking uncontrollably, than any other time in American history. And what was happening then were the families at home. When the husband gets paid, he comes home, but he already drank up his paycheck. And so you have families that are destitute. So you have these big ghettos, factory villages. There are people who are entrapped in almost like a slave like lifestyle, and it is made worse by the fact that when these hardworking people got their paychecks, they are hopelessly drinking it away, because they have been lured into this alcoholism. All right, so um, the typical American around that time is starting to notice something is wrong. And that, so those who are working class and the poorer people are exhausted. They're upset by this. Women have no vote. They don't have any way of making anything change. And there came also at the same time a kind of awakening in the church culture, and really wildly popular novels like In His Steps by Charles Sheldon, which is still a bestseller to this day, came out. And I'll give you a little summary of In His Steps. So the phrase "What would Jesus do?" came from this book. It was around 1890 when this book came out. And what it was is the book was written to this wealthy class of churchgoers, because they generally, by and large, were church-going people. And he's saying, you know what, you guys show up to church and your life is consumed on yourself. That's all. You show up to church and then the rest of everything is about you. But what would Jesus do? And so the book tells the story about churches in a community that start thinking about how Jesus would treat their own communities, and they get involved in the poor sections of town and help, train women on employable professions. They help stand up and rescue people from alcoholism. And what they came to believe was that the problem in American society was the alcohol. So there's a problem. There's poverty, there's destitution, all the wreckages of alcoholism, women who have to go into prostitution to support themselves. I mean, all kinds of wreckage. But they did not see that the problem was the unfettered factory owners just becoming filthy rich and not sharing, not giving fair wages. Had nothing to do with the capitalist structure that had no regulations. It had to do with alcohol. So if you fix the alcohol, it would take poverty and destitution and hopelessness away. And that's looking back on that now, we could see, okay, probably if we did something about wages and the factories and the wealthy people paying their part, maybe the tax structure would be better and the lifestyle would be better, and there wouldn't be as much poverty and hopelessness and maybe not as much alcoholism. But they didn't see that. They just saw, okay, it's alcohol. Alcohol is the problem. And it became such a widely accepted thing that the rest of the book in his steps was about how they took on temperance as a cause, these wealthy families in church, so that it could alleviate poverty. Um, and they were doing some good things in the community as well. But the cause, the thing that was really important, was get rid of alcohol. So temperance came up. It became over the decades such an important idea. The problem is not unfettered wealth and factories and taking advantage of hardworking poor and working class people. Was the problem was alcohol. And so it became the cause that everyone united around. So when there came an amendment proposal, the Women's Christian Temperance Union were the ones that were making a lot of noise about it, because what would Jesus do? All right. But it was totally supported by both the Democrat and the Republican parties, both big parties. The progressive movement of that era, the populist movement of that era. And you can imagine what that would look like in our US Congress if you got the populists, which we would say like are a lot of the Republican Party these days, and the progressives, some of the left leaning way parts of the Democrats. And you had them all powerfully united about one thing. All right. The suffragists were for temperance. So those are the women who wanted the vote. The Ku Klux Klan was wildly supportive of this. The NAACP was supportive of temperance. The International Workers of the World, the beginnings of the union movement. Fabulously wealthy people like Henry Ford, John D. Rockefeller Jr., Andrew Carnegie. So many of these, all kinds of people got onto the temperance movement. Like don't look over here at our wealth, look at the alcohol, that's the problem. All right. And so it was wildly popular that there be an amendment that would be change the Constitution so that there wouldn't be any more alcoholism, and poverty would go away and everything would be okay. All right, so we got that clear. That's where that came from. So by the time it was, proposed, it was fairly quickly ratified by enough states, and so the amendment gave a year from the time of ratification until a year later, at which case then the sale, the import, the export of alcohol would be banned. All right, so it in practicality fell to the states and the IRS to determine what alcohol was. So they decided it was like 5% alcohol, and some wines were probably okay. And religious institutions could continue to use alcohol in like communion and things like that, so they could use wine. But for just beverage purposes, alcohol essentially is banned, and that's going to take care of all of our problems. All right, and so you can imagine the riotousness of the week before the ban went into effect. The 1 year after the amendment was ratified, there it was. Everybody was stocking up, hoping for the future for those who enjoyed alcohol. So, all right. So now most of us know the history of what happened after that. So if there's no legal whiskey being produced, no legal, the hard liquor going on, then there's a ripe market for a mafia to come about. And so then you have all of the hubbub of the illegal activity around that. And so it makes some very dramatic parts of history. And still, we're experiencing some of the wreckage of the illicit traffic in alcohol, and then it evolves into other things over time. So things, in other words, became a hot mess. And after a while, Americans say, you know what? This we took alcohol away, and there's still alcoholics, and there's still poverty. This did not solve our problems. I wonder why we still have these problems. We did the thing that was supposed to fix everything, and it did not fix all the things. And so they were disillusioned and disappointed. And so by 1933, they say we have just got to take a step back and repeal the 18th Amendment. So by then we were up to Amendment 21. So between Amendment 18 to 21, there were other amendments that we will get to. But the Amendment 21 is going to repeal the 18th Amendment. So interestingly, this is the only repealed amendment. So have ways to change the Constitution and haven't needed to repeal any amendments except for this one. And the way this went into effect is also the only time this was happened. So you can remember from the original articles of the Constitution, if you wanted to make an amendment, it had to be approved by the states. So the Congress would pass legislation, the states would have to ratify it, and when you got enough states, then it would go into effect. It would be part of the Constitution. You could also have state constitutional congresses, and they could to ratify the amendment, going through that way. And so basically it was turning the decision over to the populace to vote for that. So each state handled that in a different way, but it was a little bit different than like the state legislatures ratifying the amendment. So it was more at the people, the American people together in each state ratified the amendment. So Amendment 21 says that the 18th article of the amendment to the Constitution of the United States is hereby repealed. That's what it says. It's like, this is it, guys. It's over. And so that was ratified in 1933. Interestingly, ratifying that amendment did not make poverty go away. And so, it took a lot more than just concentrating on alcohol, prohibition or not, to do anything about poverty. And it is an ongoing issue. What do we do to make our country a better place so that everybody has a chance at the life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, the general well-being of our people? So don't forget that we are the fourth branch of government. We the people, and we have our voices by the Constitution. And if we use our voices and keep looking for good, and those of us who are Christians, what would Jesus do? How would we live our lives here on earth so that everyone has life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? Think about that. And then we're not limited to making good just by amendments prohibiting alcohol. Okay.